Are you seeing me? Are we on the air? I believe so. We're trying to get logged in to the All You Need Is Love conference. We're waiting for our people on site to join this streaming Google Hangout. So please bear with us. This is our first time trying this. Let me see if I can.
They were in the 19th and 20th centuries in Canada and the U.S. And what they did is educate indigenous kids, Native American children from the reservations within a Euro-American standard. At the height within the U.S. in 1973, there were 60,000 students from Native reservations that were taken to these schools. And one of the most well-known ones within the United States is Carlisle Indian School, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is now a military college. As I said before, they were a tool that was used for assimilation. And the theme that went with that was kill the Indian, save the man. How these schools ran was they were given funding from the federal government, and it went to religious organizations, religious church groups, in order to school these children. We can feel a little bit removed from that, but when we look at it, what happened to these children is they were taken from their home communities and their clan systems and their family systems, and went and were forced to speak English probably by the age of 5. Most indigenous people have long hair, and it's a spiritual connection. It's our connection to the Creator. And what they did was cut those child's hair off. And we're taught from a young age to only let certain people within our families touch our hair. And so here are people we don't know cutting their hair and doing different sorts of things like that, putting in groups of with other students that are not from their tribe, not allowed to see their siblings who they would have had grown up with and had close relationships with. They were punished for speaking their language, and many and all sorts of abuse took place. And we can also maybe feel a little bit removed from that. But to break it down a little more, there were 3 Mennonite-run residential schools within the United States, and also Mennonite-run residential schools within Canada. In an effort to help right this wrong, Canada has started a truth and reconciliation process. They have national events within the provinces and also do regional events. Lorraine, Iris, and Carolyn and I had the opportunity to travel to British Columbia to witness one of these events. And we sat in a talking circle, which was put on by a lot of the church leaders, and people who ahead of time submitted their names to be a part of this talking circle. So it was survivors who wanted to tell their story and get an apology from the people from the church that represented those institutions. The circle we sat in was mixed company, men and women, indigenous people, non-indigenous people. And the one story I'd like to share comes from a woman. And I remember her speaking, and at the very end she said, these are the stories, we don't want to tell, but we have to tell these stories. And sometimes within us, if we carry those stories, we find it hard to tell. But if we tell it here, we expect that as a listener, you will tell these stories other places, so that the truth can come out, the truth can be known, and the pain can be worked towards healing. It was interesting because we went around in circle process, and when it got to her, she was very angry, as she should be. And she spoke about being abused by nuns, and she was actually a 3rd-generation survivor. Her grandmother and her mother had gone to boarding school, and she had as well. And she said she never heard her parents tell her that they loved her, nor did she ever tell her children that she loved them. And she was just mimicking the parenting skills she learned from the nuns. As the circle went on, she talked about her husband and how angry she was with him because she went to a Catholic boarding school and he was a devout Catholic. And how every time he practiced his faith, she was angry with him. And throughout their relationship, they had to struggle to find that, and also struggle to find how to raise their children within the context of his religion and her adversity to it because of her abuse. And I remember one profound story she told about witnessing and trying to help children being abused when they would speak their language, and how she couldn't understand. They would teach, Jesus came and he did this, he did this, he did this. But every time that they beat her, they said, in the name of Jesus. And so she wondered, who is this Jesus? If you tell me he is love, then why is he abusing me? And she talked about, she could understand maybe that since you are telling me I am a dirty Indian, maybe this is why. But she could not understand why you would beat your white children as well. There were nuns who got pregnant in the boarding schools and also had children. So she said, as a young child, she was wrestling, was trying to understand that maybe you could do this to me, but I'm still trying to find humanity in you, that you would be children that look like you and perhaps could be your own children. What came out of the boarding school was a lot of shame. And when I look at this and I listen to her story and I go to my analytical brain and realize I would rather go there because I too am a survivor of a parent that went to boarding school and 2 grandparents that went to boarding school. And so I go to my analysis and I look at that story. And what I say is, what from this story is what is it saying to me? What did this Christian God or this Christian Jesus, what did he bring to Indigenous people? And I think when I break it down, there was an assumption that we didn't know God. In order to come and impose this on someone, you're saying you do not know God, you do not know Jesus, or the way in which you know them is not the way which is right. What also comes with that is either or thinking. Either you're a Christian and you quit being a native indigenous person who God made you to be, or you stay indigenous and you cannot become a Christian. And it also, what comes with that in my mind is you say one thing and you do another. And it speaks to what Corinthia shared yesterday about the action behind the word love. And also what I think is forget what has been done. We still have missionaries coming into our reservation that want to glaze over and look at the problems we have and come to fix things without realizing the historical nature of these problems. And one thing that I'm delving into and trying further to understand was even this assumption that we would be on the same understanding as to what love means. I briefly glanced over my Cheyenne dictionary and I found there were 6 words for love, and that there were 12 other versions of it, depending on who you were speaking to and within what context. But in none of those were they ever a noun. They were always an action-oriented word. Thanks, Lydia. So when I look at that and I say, what does this Christian love look like, from my perception and hearing this? Then I have to switch to my indigenous concept. And what are indigenous people? What am I saying about Christian love from my own space? And what's coming out of communities is healing, and not only for an individual, but for our communities as a whole, and also for our institutions that we function in. So what does this look like for me to look at my own trauma from my parents having gone to boarding school, to look at the church, the Mennonite church I grew up in, as being a part of that colonization system, and then looking to the whole of Mennonite church who participated in boarding schools for Native people. And it also means that I don't call myself a Christian. If you're familiar with the late Richard Twist, he never called himself a Christian, and this is a common movement within Native communities. If you call yourself a Christian, you're associating with this wrongdoing. So what he has come about to say is we say that we live the Jesus way. And that sets it apart from Christianity, and I think gives it more action. And so you'll see that in a lot of indigenous communities. And also to recognize that we hear differently. We're still at some places where we're not allowed to have a drum within a church, but we can use a piano. My church started singing songs in our traditional language, and so we can use our language too. And just doing different things that are more specific to us. But when I look at that and I have this perception of people from the outside, and then I can look at my own community, look at myself, and see that we have this perception of what we are and the work we can do. And we also know in our community, since this harm was done together, we realize we must also heal together. So we're doing our work, and so I wonder, how do we do this work collectively? And so I go back to what Laura shared last night. Where do we go from here? How do you need to be healed? And looking at that individually, how do you need to be healed? In your community, how do we need to be healed? And more broadly, how does the Mennonite Church need to be healed?
What a minute. Technology moment. Okay, we'll have a change of plans here, and I'll go next. I was given the task of talking about loving in the context of our personal relationships, how to negotiate our everyday lives in terms of people that have harmed us and that we might call enemies. I found this to be a very challenging topic, and I can only address it as someone on a journey with much, much to learn. I haven't had devastating experiences of direct trauma, which so many people in our world have had, and you'll see Pia has much to share about sort of ongoing, very brutal oppression that she's experiencing, she and her community. And yet, I find that I struggle to live what I say that I believe, that Christ does call us and enables us to live in peace and justice with all people. Yet, as I mentioned, how does one do this in all my relationships, and especially with those from whom I've experienced hurt or disrespect and disregard? And as I kept thinking about this in my own life, I had to acknowledge that some of my most difficult experiences have been in the church. The Mennonite conference that I grew up in and where I settled again as an adult spent decades arguing about whether women could openly exercise leadership in the church. At one point, things became so heated that conference leaders placed a 5-year moratorium on public discussion of the issue. Sadly, this ban was lifted not so long ago, within the last decade. So this is still fairly new. Whether intended or not, the message communicated by many church leaders to and about women I found to be very harmful. That women were a problem. In fact, a problem so difficult and contentious that we couldn't even talk about it. Indeed, something was so wrong with women that even Christ could not fully redeem them and make them worthy participants in the life of the church. Or women were mistaken in hearing God's call and wanting to use all their gifts in the church. Or, God forbid, God had actually made some mistakes and given some women the wrong kind of gifts. So these are some of the questions that I've struggled with for many, many years, and my husband can probably can attest to that. And I've often thought of Luke's account of Jesus' resurrection, when several women went to the tomb and learned that Jesus was risen from the dead. But when the women returned and told the other disciples, Luke records that these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe the women. 2,000 years later, it often feels like this is still happening. Women experience the risen Christ, but many do not believe them. For me, this was especially difficult because I loved the church and had committed myself to it. I loved studying the Bible and working with others to understand what these stories mean for us today. So to find myself unwelcome here, where I most longed to feel at home, often led me to dismal, joyless places. For a time, I wore mourning clothes to church, mourning as in grief, to somehow express my grief and resolution. Often, I wondered if God loved women, love me? Could God love me? Often I viewed church leaders with suspicion. Often I felt they were my enemies, and often I was tempted to leave. So this is one thing I have learned about how I tend to deal with enemies. I try to avoid them, run away, or cut myself off. Of course, there are times when this is a good strategy. There are times when we need to leave a dangerous situation or an unsafe relationship. But when does avoiding people become harmful and destructive? When does not acknowledging someone or wanting them out of my life become a way of denying them as people? Certainly it's not the same as killing someone, not nearly as final, but the effect is similar to make them disappear from my life. Again, part of this is good. It's a way of being honest, of not pretending that things are okay. But what does this do to my spirit, and how does this help build a world that I say I believe in? A world that has room enough for everyone, a world where all people can thrive. And this is what I've had to examine in my own life. Unfortunately, our society tells us every day that the most effective way to deal with problem people is to lock them up, isolate them, or even destroy them. But this does not lead to life, and it's not how I would want others to deal with me. So over the years, I have been trying to learn how to stay, to learn how to move toward the other person and engage with them rather than avoid them, to not put someone in a box and keep them there forever. This is truly countercultural and goes against the grain of our society and our first impulses. Yet I have so much appreciated when people have extended this grace to me. When my husband and I lived in Laos, for instance, we often represented the enemy. We were citizens of a nation that had inflicted great harm on those people, and yet they welcomed us and made space to talk with us. So how do I do this with a neighbor family from whom I felt disrespect and disregard? When their children have thrown stones or taught their dogs to jump over the fence into our yard, it has been so tempting to avoid them, and yet over many years I have found that conversation helps and provides some basis for addressing things that come up. And in the church I have tried to stay, to speak up and share my experience and understanding of the scriptures. But this has been a hard lesson to learn. I grew up with a deeply ingrained voice telling me I should always be nice, always give in. In fact, I was taught that following Jesus meant non-resistance, not resisting evil, even if it costs you your life. So it's very uncomfortable to speak up and actively state one's needs or what one knows to be true. And when I do, there is so much honesty that makes me second guess myself. One example was when I was in a position of leadership in our congregation, and someone was pressuring our pastor in a very insensitive and domineering way. I ended up writing a strong email, but then I lay awake for hours that night, deeply worried that I had gone too far, and this pastor, whom I so admired, would be shocked and dismayed by what I had written. Imagine my shock then when she expressed incredible relief and gratitude that I had spoken up and taken some of the heat off her shoulders. This was a good reminder that sometimes it is absolutely vital to speak up and use one's power to resist that which is wrong in order to promote more just and peaceful relationship. At other times, however, I have been challenged to listen and reflect more about myself. I have had to acknowledge and confess my failures and wrongdoing, my own disregard for another's experience and perspective. I've also had to consider that my enemy may reveal something within myself that I don't want to see or acknowledge. Walter Waite calls this the gift that our enemies can give us, to see aspects of ourselves that we cannot discover any other way. Since our friends rarely tell us these things, he writes, we have no other access to those unacceptable parts of ourselves that need redeeming except through the mirror that our enemies hold up to us. This is indeed a difficult lesson and one I will keep learning for the rest of my life. Is the self-righteousness I react to in someone else something I dread in myself? Is my fear of failure similar to what drives my enemy? And how is my theological certainty different from that of my opponent? Reflecting on these aspects of ourselves and bringing them to God can help us avoid becoming what we hate. This also helps turn the focus away from the person to the systems, the principalities and powers which enslave and diminish us all. Admittedly, this is not a panacea. I think there are still times when it's necessary to leave. Situations in which the relationship is just too destructive or the message is too stifling and deadening. I think if the bishops in Lancaster Mennonite Conference had not relented and permitted the ordination of women pastors, I would have had to leave our conference. And I know that there are other situations that are not healthy for me either, where I should not engage because the dynamics would tear me down too much and lead me away from life, away from God. But then I have found that it's helpful to let go and not let that person or situation control me. This is one aspect of forgiveness, not letting myself continue to be held in bondage to that situation, but to somehow leave things in God's hands, trusting deeply in God's love and opening myself to healing and wholeness. I recall another time when I felt a powerful person had treated me and others very disrespectfully. I tried to talk with him, but this did not help. It felt very much like he could not hear what I was saying. I then tried avoidance, but in the end, that wasn't possible either. Eventually, I consciously chose to relinquish this hurt because I did not like what it was doing to me. This doesn't mean we're now great friends. I don't think I can ever fully trust him, but I can at least be cordial. And I am no longer bound by the feelings of pain and anger which had held me fast. Fortunately, there are more positive experiences of engagement. Over the years, I have found that some people I had struggled with earlier are now very helpful allies and have very much needed gifts and abilities, and I have learned to appreciate them. This is one advantage of being close to 60, knowing that time and new experiences can open new possibilities for relating to and appreciating people. Indeed, this has happened in my home church, which now feels much more welcoming to women. And women and men serve together in all positions, and we are a much stronger community as a result. I wonder if this is what happened in the early church after that post-resurrection experience when the men failed to trust the women. While on one hand it's discouraging that this happened, I find it fascinating that this incident was recorded and passed on to us. Did the women insist on this, or were the men so chagrined that they felt compelled to admit their mistake? In any case, those early disciples did not gloss over the incident, but rather admitted their mistake and gave us a window into their life together. And this is my prayer, that God would give us the wisdom and the courage to be honest and to extend grace, to know when to engage and when to leave, when to listen and learn and when to speak, when to resist and when to forgive and let go. May it be so.
Maybe just another moment until we can get the audio going. And so I want to take this opportunity for us to all stand up and stretch out our bodies. But instead of standing up and getting into conversation, I wonder if we could do this in the spirit that Annabelle led us this morning. I don't know how to lead you as well. But if you remember a little bit of what she asked us to do, stretching up as high as you can and down low. And as you do that, take in the stories that we are hearing as we are hearing them. And as you feel ready, come back to your seats. The story that we have from Hias is in video form. In conversation afterward about how this session would work, we decided to start it a couple minutes in to the video. So when we start it, it's going to be sort of in the middle of a thought or sentence. So don't feel disoriented by that, but it will pick up and be oriented well, I think.
And it's our life. It is the source of our livelihood. It is where our culture and political structure is deeply rooted. And on the other hand, for the state, well, the right to land can be acquired, it can be sold, it can be bought. The value of land is only seen through its monetary and commercial value. Everything is so segmented that you can just sell off the trees, the lots, you can just block off the rivers and build a mega dam for electricity, which will be utilized for private corporations. You can just extract every mineral resources which can be found. And even the people, you can exploit the people to gain more income from that. So today, we, the indigenous people, are denied of our rights to our ancestral land and resources and our traditional democratic self-rule. So if we would look at the issue of mining, with liberalized mining institutionalized by the Mining Act of 1995, which practically allows for up to 100% foreign ownership of our mineral resources and our mineral land, actually poses the biggest threat currently to our rights to ancestral land at present. CAS has already accounted at least 251 approved mining applications, which covers about more than 500,000 hectares of ancestral land. This is about 50% of the total approved mining applications in the country. The mining industry in our country is dominated by transnational corporations, which actually result to massive destruction of ancestral land and livelihood, death of our rivers, the plunder of our mineral resources, and contribute only a few to the employment, both national and local, and also to the genuine and sustainable development of our communities. Large energy projects are also one of the development aggressions that we are facing as communities. Energy projects also thrive as economic programs of the government prioritizing the privatization of energy industry. Today, there are at least 27 hydroelectric dams that have been built, under construction, or in the pipeline, which will submerge several indigenous communities. Just for example, Kulangi Dam in southern Philippines, in Mindanao, will affect 23 villages of Lumal and Moro people. Halaor Dam, on the other hand, which will be built in the central Philippines, will be affecting 13 villages of indigenous people, and that's about 17,000 indigenous people. Land is also being converted into monocrop plantations, such as the 20,000 hectares oil palm plantation of A. Brown company in Bukidnon in Mindanao, which encroaches the land of the Ilocano people. In part of Luzon, southern Luzon, the oil palm plantation in southern Palawan covers 7 towns, which are mostly inhabited by Palawan indigenous people.
What could be the response of the indigenous people's communities when this kinds of threat to our lands and our lives and the future generations' lives is
Well, the assaults made to indigenous people's rights were countered with resistance in defense of our collective rights amid the attacks to our social, economic rights and security. Some of the example of our resistance is the People's Barricade in the province of Vizcaya against several mining corporations like the Royal Mining Corporation, FCM Mineral, and Oceana Gold Corporation. Another focal point in the indigenous people's struggle, recent struggle, is the food protest of the survivors of some of the most recent typhoons, which has hit southern Philippines in December 2012 and in central Philippines just November 2013, which affected at least 15,000 indigenous people's families in the said area. Indigenous peoples led and participated in one of the biggest food protests in demanding for just relief and rehabilitation. Many other acts of defiance against mining, energy projects, urbanization, and other issues were made by indigenous peoples in form of campaigns and protests in the community as well as in urban centers. Several communities actually have already declared their unity to defend their ancestral lands, which are at risk of mining, and to call for the repeal of the Mining Act of 1995. Another highlight of the indigenous people's struggle against mining industry is the Pangayaw, or tribal war, being waged by the Blaan people in the SMI Extra National Glencore mine site in southern Philippines, which is considered as the largest foreign investment in the Philippines. Hopefully, these give you a picture why our communities are militant. First, they have clear interest in our rich lands, and second, we are resisting and struggling to assert our collective rights over these lands and for our self-determination. In the course of defending our ancestral territories, the indigenous peoples who oppose to sell out their lands are faced by heightened militarization in their communities. It has become actually a common practice for government agents to brand the indigenous people as rebels, supporters of guerrilla groups, or even terrorists. To give you more sharing about my personal experience, my grandmother was a court in the mid-1970s up to the 1980s. My grandmother was a part of a white people's movement, which was headed by indigenous people, communities, who are opposing the World Bank construction of a mega dam along the Chico River. She was one of the women leaders in our community who stood up against the fascist dictatorship under the martial law, and who also felt harassment and intimidation from the state forces, armed forces. Starting in the late 1980s, my mom also got active in indigenous people's movement to defend our ancestral lands and to advocate and to advance a development work from the people for the people. Even after the martial law, the attacks to the civil and political rights of the people continued, but this time under different counterinsurgency programs. My mom actually has been also included in the government order of battle list, which targets to pacify or liquidate the civilians who are legitimately fighting for their collective rights. It's actually the persistence of those who were ahead of me. They're persistent to defend our rights and to stand for a dignified life of the future generations, which inspired me to know more about our culture, the issues of our communities, and even other communities, and to actually be part of a collective struggle for our ancestral lands and self-determination, despite the attacks of the government to its people. Under the operational plan Bayanihan, which is the government's current software insurgency program, the indigenous people continue to live a destructive cycle of dislocation, forced eviction, harassment, massacre, bombing, and other forms of grave human rights abuses. While corporate businesses continue to intrude our ancestral land. Often Bayanihan goes in tandem with the administration or the government's economic program by all intents. It is a program to quell the people's defiance of business interests and suppress the legal people's movement that demands meaningful reform and social change. This results to the violation of civil political rights of as well as indigenous people. Like the previous administration, the Aquino government has used state armed forces to quell the resistance of the indigenous people and targeted members, leaders, and even communities. There have been 39 documented killings of indigenous people since Aquino held power in June 2010 until December 6 of 2013. Out of these 39 individuals, 6 were children of indigenous people's leaders. 5 were women, one of which was pregnant at the time of her death. For the past 3 years, CAMP has also recorded 16 incidences of forced evacuation of indigenous peoples involving an approximate of 9,754 individuals, including peasant centers. These evacuations happened in several indigenous communities in 5 provinces in Mindanao, southern Philippines. Just last year, there have been bombings in 2 communities in northern Luzon. The bombing destroyed farms, irrigation facilities of Igorot tribes, and caused trauma to the residents, especially the children. The filing of trumped charges against leaders and members of organizations, leading to the people's struggle against destructive projects, militarization, and other issues pertaining to indigenous people's rights and welfare, is a trend in the past years. 37 members of MAPASU is an organization which means persevering struggle for next generation from Matobo tribe in Mindanao, were charged of rebellion, suspect, murder, arson, illegal possession of firearms and explosive, and malicious mischief. The meritless case was meant to harass, intimidate, and illegal immigrants. They led the people's struggle against mining encroachment and human rights violation committed by state forces. Similarly, in Bangkayan, in Luzon, more than 200 community members were slapped with trumped charges in relation to the community's opposition to the Levanto Mining Corporation's pending expansion, among the other environmental issues and of workers' rights. In Nueva Vizcaya, a temporary restraining order acquired by Royal Cobo Philippines Incorporated was served by the police and military to the barricade sites, ordering 15 leaders of the barricades to desist in participating in maintaining the barricades. So from all these experiences, how do we define love? I think from our history, our experiences, it's showing the greatest respect to Mother Earth, our ancestors who have went ahead of us and have developed and defended our land for the next generation. And love is the continuation of this great tradition for the next generation. Love is about caring for your brothers and sisters, your community, and majority of the people in your society. Love will flourish not just by ending the militarization of our communities, nor by the simple absence of violence. It is in our search for social justice and genuine recognition of our collective rights to ancestral land and self-determination that we find and develop now. So as to end this sharing, if sharing with you, I would also want to share with you some of the words of our women elders in our community. She says that the generation of my people have nurtured, protected, and defended our land for many centuries now. Our people resisted hundreds of years of colonial rule. We have struggled against those who consider our land only as a resource base. Today, we continue to fight and struggle against these oppressors. We will not allow our resources to be further exploited. For us, land is life. This land is what kept generations of my people alive. This land is where we are going. Again, thank you very much, and I hope that you can join us in our campaign to stop the killings of indigenous people and to immediately repeal the operation of land by its hands, which is in disguise of peace and development, which actually is still continuing to violate the civil and political rights of the indigenous peoples, which is very linked to the economic interest in our country.
And of course, to give justice to all the victims of human rights violation. Again, unay ka na kayo identified.
We have such beautiful candles, and it seems a pity not to light them. And I wanted to light them for each of our storytellers to thank them for kindling in our hearts the love of God that never dies away. I also want to do a time check. Okay, so when do I need to stop? Okay, we'll talk about that one. My task is to kind of weave together the stories that we've heard and to reflect on what Christian love means from a more theological framework in light of these experiences. And I get to do that because my academic training is systematic theology and constructive theology, which means to build things out of thin air. But I've actually found that sometimes that's a little too abstract even for me. And actually, like Olympia, when I saw the title of the conference, I also thought of a song. It was a different song. It was a song by the Beatles, where they're reassuring us that all you need is love, love is all you need. I actually want to challenge that. I think in addition to love, we need yarn, we need add these things to our altar, but we also need a lot of justice, which I think, at least for me, that's sort of the common fiber, that's the common thread, that's the common yarn that is running through the stories that we heard. If I were to encapsulate that into a statement, what I heard from Erica, Linda, and Pia is that they have, as women, experienced a reality in which their existence was a problem for somebody else. So that the question now is, what does our understanding of the Christian gospel move us to say in face of such a statement? How are we called to respond when, in the name of the Christian gospel, someone is told your existence is a problem for me? In the Christian tradition, particularly in the Christian West, in the 20th century, we have drawn on the work of a man named Anders Nygren, who's a Swedish theologian. He published 2 books in 1930, one in 1930 and one in 1936, Eros and Agape. Eros and Agape, of course, are 2 Greek terms used that are translated into the English word love, and they describe different kinds of love. Eros, Nygren explained, is that kind of heady, passionate, lustful love. It's creative and wonderful and helps make the world go round, but it's not the best expression of Christian love. Christian love is agape, or agape. It is something that moves us to set aside the ego. It is kenotic, that is, it moves us to empty ourselves so that we can look out unconditionally for the other. And the reason why agape became the standard, the ideal, the definition of Christian love is because, again, that was how we were to understand Jesus' actions on the cross, that he gave up his life for us. The Philippians hymn describes it that way very clearly. Right? At this point in the discourse of Christian theology, thankfully, Nygren's work is not, while it's still something you got to read, you have to know what he says, there have been pushbacks from that to that construction of an understanding of love. And they come from feminist theologians, among others, but particularly feminists. Part of the pushback from feminist theology was saying that Eros is that creative, powerful love that women's experience seem to demonstrate over and over again. And certainly the story that Linda cited, where Mary Magdalene becomes the apostle to the apostles. She's the one who reported the gospel to the people who were supposed to be closest to the gospel. And she is revered and held up that way. But at the same time, I didn't actually hear that phrase, Mary Magdalene, apostles to the apostles, until I was way up high in graduate school. I was more familiar with Mary Magdalene being the woman who was filled with demons, or the woman who was caught in adultery, that sort of gospel amalgamation that we receive in Sunday school. So, again, biblical text, which is one of our primary sources for theological reflection, that offers us into the insights into the way, or the fact that women aren't actually more problem for the church. We continue to sort of be blind to that. So again, what does our understanding of the Christian gospel move us to say when we are met with the statement, your existence is a problem for me? Reconciliation is often one approach that's used to respond. Reconciliation, the desire to figure out how to bring together 2 opposing perspectives, 2 opposing forces, and find a place for them to meet in the middle where transformation can happen and everything's wonderful, there's confetti and balloons, everybody's hugging, sometimes referred to as sloppy agape. That's love, but without the justice. And a friend of mine who has been doing a lot of anti-racism work as a white Christian social ethicist, is proposing that maybe we need to start talking about reparations more as Christians. Now, before you reach for your pocketbooks and batten down the hatches, reparations has not become a bad rap. We often think of reparations as a call from angry people of color who want money to make things right. And that's not, I mean, that's part of the reparations conversation. But if we break down the word reparation, it actually comes from the word repair. So where reconciliation is a desire to try to figure out how to collapse differences so that people can experience some sense of unity, reparations is about trying to figure out how do we need to, what's the work that we need to do to repair the harm that's been done. And that actually needs to be the first step in moving toward reconciliation. Think about it as reparation is trying to build a bridge, rebuild a bridge that's been burnt down. What I like about my friend Jennifer's suggestion that we need to work at reparations in the church is that it takes me back, I mean, it captures my imagination. And it takes me to that passage in Isaiah where the people are called on to be repairers of the breach. So there's something very scriptural about reparations that complements the very scriptural notion of reconciliation as well. And I think when we pair reparations with reconciliation, it allows us to acknowledge our humanness in the best sense of the word, in the fullest sense of the word, that we have emotions, that we get angry, that we are hurt, that we are offended. This is connecting to the things that we heard in the stories. I'm thinking here how Erica talked about the reality of shame and how shame came out of the boarding school experience and was transmitted from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. You don't just get over that. That kind of damage, I don't know that it ever goes away. But if there are tools that can figure out how to help us fix what has been broken in our society to cause that kind of harm, then perhaps we'll be wiser the next time somebody is confronted with a statement that your existence is a problem for me, that we won't take that approach, that we will have learned something, at least I hope. Love as something that involves healing is another common thread that I heard woven in these stories. Living in the Jesus way, being open to God, to relinquish and release ourselves from emotional bondage. These are also, I think, some expressions or nods toward this traditional construction of agape, but it's different because it isn't simply about putting others' needs first. It's about paying attention to the integrity of community and paying attention to the integrity of relationship. In other words, what I hear us saying Christian love is for us as members and participants in Mennonite Church USA, as women in the Christian community, is that we're interested in how our experience of harm, evil, sin, and the way those things have been perpetrated against us in structural, systematic, and personal ways can be undone so that we don't hurt anymore. Again, how we figure that out, though, is a challenge, because when we get into the language of emotions, when we take our experience that seriously, that we talk about how we feel, there is no formula, there is no prayer, there is no liturgy, there is no nice, tight way, no Sunday school illustration, take-home paper, that prepares us for what that work involves and what it looks like. So what does our understanding of the Christian gospel move us to say when the work of reparation is happening? That's something I'm not sure about. I don't know. I can't say. And in some ways, it's not my job, perhaps. What I can say is that you need yarn and knitting needles. One of the things that I've learned about knitting is it's kind of amazing how something that looks like that, it's just a string, can get turned into something that looks like this, just by putting it, wrapping it, or knowing how to wrap it and loop it around two little sticks. It's kind of a miracle. But the other way I've come to think about my little pastime of knitting, which I suppose is all just one big rationalization for the insane amount of money I spend on fiber, is that there's something biblical about this concept of taking a thread and turning it into something that looks like this. God is referred to in Scripture as a knitter, right? Can I get an amen? And you know, it is God who knit us in our mother's womb. There's a foreknowledge there. There is intention. There's creativity. There is design. There's an awareness that you don't always get the gauge right. And maybe you end up with something that's a little too small or a little too big. It doesn't always turn out quite the way it looked in the picture of the pattern. So maybe in addition to yarn and knitting needles and some justice and some reparation, we need a little grace, or maybe we need a lot of grace. And maybe it is that love includes all of these things, and so all we do need is love. I don't know. But it seems to me that if that was true, we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be having a conference, because we'd all have figured this out by now. So it is more complicated. It does take practice. It takes experimentation. It takes persistence. These are all things that we heard in the stories that were told. If our existence is a problem for people, we have to figure out how to respond based on our understanding of the gospel, the integrity of the cosmic knitter, who curled and knitted us just right, even if the gauge is off a little bit. We are as we are intended to be, I think. Love is healing, living the Jesus way, being open to God, understanding that we are not an inconvenience or an accident. We are connected. There is something beautiful, and there is reason to hope. Perhaps out of this conference we may commission ourselves to be like Mary, to be apostles to the apostles, to say to the church, to leaders in the church, those who we entrust with power and authority to help us interpret the gospel. There are some ways that you aren't getting that message quite right. There are other witness accounts that are just as much part of the canon, just as much part of the experience of this vessel of the church. And we know that you love us, but we also need a little justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Melinda. And we are grateful to Thea as well. We will send her our gratitude. A couple of the words that you just mentioned at the end of Melinda really stood out to me. You said, we are not an inconvenience or an accident. We here collectively and we each individual of us. We are not an inconvenience or an accident. We are connected. We are something beautiful, and there is reason for hope. Thank you. We don't have time for our circle groups in the way that we envisioned, and so we are going to encourage you instead, before we go out from this space, to gather with those that you met in our circle groups yesterday around the table where you were before, and just check in with each other and see if maybe there would be a time later on this evening where you would want to get in touch with each other. No pressure. If you're not feeling the need for that, then you don't need to do it. But at least check in to see if that is something that anybody would like. And if not, then just be mindful of whether or not you personally are feeling a need to talk with others in order to process all of that is going on here. There is a lot going on here. And sometimes one-on-one conversation can be helpful. If you were not here yesterday and you don't know what your group is, you can look on the yellow sheet in your folders, and also meet me up here at the front and I can help get you connected. So, thank you, and have a good afternoon.
I just covered up that weird thing. Yeah, because look, yeah,
I realized why you did it. So.
It's different now, but it wasn't actually his face. It was like this cartoon face.
Oh,
but it was just
one
weird.
Yeah,
because it was just like a man.
How do I get out of it now? I didn't even think of that. I'm so glad you like it. I think it's
I
invisible up
noticed it
there.
when I was looking down when I was up there. I'm like, what is that? I'm like, oh, that's Chris Icon.
Right.
So and I was like, how do I cover it without?
Am I out of this now? Do you know, like, because we set up a Google Hangout. Actually, 2 people joined us online. It's what we know. It says recording. How do I like get out of it?
There are just a couple announcements.
There we go.
Thank you.